This is Chapter 4, Gender Inequality, from Social Problems in Contemporary Society. Okay, so what is gender, right? If we're going to talk about sex and gender, first we have to define what these things are. So it's important to distinguish that sex is the biological distinction that we put in our culture between females and males. And again, we'll get to how that's also a narrow description in a moment. But gender is the social definition, the social understanding of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman in a binary gender system in our culture. So gender is the personality traits and life chances that a society links to being female or male. So it's interesting when we talk about gender being socially constructed. What that means is the definitions of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman come from the cultural definitions, come from the history, come from the social meanings, right? So for instance, pink is for girls, blue is for boys, right? This is something that is not inherently biological or somehow just a natural phenomenon. This has to do with culture. What's actually really interesting about the whole pink and blue thing is that it used to be the other way around. It literally used to be the opposite, that blue was associated with little girls because it was associated with the Virgin Mary, and that pink was associated with boys because it was considered kind of like a muted red, and red was considered a leadership color or a kind of, royal or kind of commanding, powerful color. So it's really interesting that that switched around the turn of the last century. And before that, we just put babies in like a white dress, male or female, because, babies just vomit and crap and get stuff all over their clothes. It was a lot easier for people to bleach it when it was just like a white dress or smock you put over your baby, right? Nowadays, it's all about like accessorizing your baby. So anyway, before I start talking about baby accessories, just to really reiterate, in our culture, we define what does it mean to be masculine? What does it mean to be feminine? So this is what we're going to kind of break down as well. And how does the culture define these things, and how does it continue and perpetuate throughout generations, largely because of our social interactions? So if gender is socially constructed, meaning there's no, again, if we want to see something socially constructed, we just have to look across time within one culture or across various cultures. So if we look at definitions of masculinity or femininity around the world, they vary wildly, and they vary dramatically even within our own culture over time, right? What it meant to be a man 200 years ago, 100 years ago is different than what it means now. So we understand these meanings evolve and they connect to the historical time period in which we're in. But this concept of a gender binary, the idea that you're this or that, that's something we're going to kind of attack as well when we talk about how narrow of a definition that really is, as there are people who are non-binary, there are people who are trans, there are people who are gender non-conforming or gender fluid that don't fit into a binary of this or that. And even when it comes to sex, this is something that also has an influence of the culture, meaning we always say, okay, there's only two sexes, male, female, right? And we connect this to kind of the genetic understandings or chromosomes to say, okay, well, if you're XX, you're female. If you're XY, you're male. But we also know there's variations there as well, right? There are people who have two X chromosomes and a Y chromosome, like Klinefelter syndrome. There are people that actually even have an extra Y. There are situations where, because of hormonal differences, that people develop mixed sex characteristics, or even are born intersexed, meaning having sexual characteristics of both biological men and biological women. So this concept of like you're this or that doesn't even work with sex. Like you could technically, at least according to Anne Fausto Sterling, you could say that there's about 5 biologically distinct categories of people. And what's interesting about the intersexed is that it's actually more common to be born intersexed than it is to have these other conditions that we've heard of, like cerebral palsy. You've heard of cerebral palsy, you've seen people with cerebral palsy, less common than being born intersexed. Or how about Down syndrome, right? How many of you know someone that has Down syndrome? Like most of us do. And Down syndrome is less common than being born intersexed. and we'll talk about this later too, but some people don't even know they're intersexed until later on, like some medical condition happens and they find out they have mixed sex characteristics. This actually happened to a friend of mine that I worked with years ago that, she was actually going through the process of having her first child, and that's when she found out that she had mixed sex characteristics and that she also had some, basically internally, she had some male genitalia as well, which was really interesting. So it just shows that we're much more complicated than we think. And even when it comes to this idea of you're this or that, it's too narrow a focus. Of course, the majority of people do fit into this or that when it comes to biological sex. But there's so many that don't. And so by erasing them from, existence, we'll kind of circle back to that. But there's a lot of problems that come with that. Specifically, in our culture, it's normative if a baby is born intersexed to make the baby undergo several surgeries on its genitals to fit the category that we have in society. So that's the way that it's socially constructed, right? There's this article I make students read at Kelsey Fullerton, my sexualities class, that talks about how, this doctor, they're asking him, why are you performing these unnecessary surgeries on babies? And he says, because it's easier to fix the child than fix society. And that's a terrible reason to make a child undergo multiple surgeries. So anyway, that's just kind of the distinction I want to bring to. Obviously, sex is the biological understanding, gender is the social understanding, but they are both influenced by the culture. Of course, gender more so than sex. So gender stratification is the unequal distribution of wealth, power, and privilege between, different genders. So typically this is looked at in a very cisgender male-female dichotomy, but we also know when it comes to the hierarchy of gender, yes, cis males are at the top, then cis females, but then people who are non-binary, gender non-conforming, or transgender are, further demonized or made deviant in that kind of stratification, right? So they have less wealth, power, privilege, etc. Than women. So patriarchy is part of where this social understanding comes from. And we understand that this is very, colonization, European culture, ideology. There are many other cultures in the world that were more matriarchal, right? Patriarchy just literally means rule by fathers. It's a social pattern in which males dominate females. And that we come to understand men as better than or more competent, more trustworthy. You give them the benefit of the doubt. They're the leaders, they're the protectors, like all the kind of things, the social roles that we consider most important are basically assumed to be male, right? Versus a matriarchy, which is very, very rare as a social pattern, is where females dominate males. We don't really see a lot of matriarchies. We do see situations where mothers' lineages matter within other cultures, versus you can tell it's patriarchy when you only have your father's name, right? Things like that kind of show the way that we understand, who's most important within that kind of dynamic, right? So it's interesting when you look at different explanations of patriarchy, obviously sociologists reject the idea that somehow patriarchy is just the default, that it's biological, that it's hardwired into our biology. Or sometimes people will say, oh, it's because of the cavemen. Oh man, those ones kill me. Because you're like, oh, you're an anthropologist? Oh, wow, you've studied diverse cultures over time? Oh, no, you just studied one culture in a 101 class, and then you're applying that to the understanding of entire thousands of years of human history. Cool. So often what happens is we overgeneralize this stuff and we tend to think of history as a straight line, like whatever it is today was that exact way in the past, and that's just completely untrue, right? On the contrary, though, when it comes to, instead of it being biological, sociologists say patriarchy and all the behaviors that are linked to gender are creations of society, and they change. And they're something that, we imbue with meanings. Okay, so when it comes to prejudice and discrimination, it's quite clear that our culture assigns more worth to things that we consider masculine and then those that are considered feminine. So there's this dichotomy, right? When we have a gender binary that says you're this or you're that, what we've done is created a world of opposites. The idea is that what one group has, the other group doesn't, which is completely preposterous, right? So the idea is like, if you are in the category of masculinity, then you have strength, right? You have aggression, you're a hard worker, this kind of stuff. But then the opposite is supposedly true of women, right? That where men are supposedly strong always by default biologically, women are then therefore weak, right? And so it's just this weird, like, kind of teeter-totter where you just put different characteristics on one end or the other, and it denies us our full humanity. As women can be leaders, and men can also be compassionate, right? As women can be, strong and confident, and men can also be caretakers and supportive and loving. So this weird thing where we say like, nope, these are the characteristics we associate it with femininity, and that's the only people that are allowed to enact those things without being punished, right? Versus, for men, it's interesting. They get punished more when they kind of go against gendered expectations and act in any way that's considered feminine. Why? Because then they're challenging the hierarchy of society that assumes that men are better than women, or what we call androcentrism. The idea that masculine things are inherently better. So whether it's a woman doing that or a man doing that or someone who's non-binary or trans, it doesn't matter. We essentialize that things that are considered masculine are good, things that are considered feminine are weak or just less important. So we associate a lot of characteristics with these things, and then we basically are born into a system that puts us in a box and tells us, here's the characteristics you're allowed to develop. Right? And so sexism comes from this, because the prejudice that says that one group is better than the other, or certain characteristics are appropriate and not appropriate for others, leads to sexism, or the belief that one sex is innately superior to the other. And this is really, again, it's not that this is, because people will say, oh, well, all of history has been like this. Not really. It's much more the kind of colonial European history. And that's really the only one we learn oftentimes in the United States. So it gives us a false impression that this has been the case throughout human history, which is just not true. There's been a plurality of different cultural understandings, and especially when it comes to gender, different expressions and different roles and organizations of gender throughout cultures and throughout time. So sexism involves not just individual attitudes and people's beliefs, like saying, okay, well, let's say you're picking a team for a sport and you have people lined up, you're going to often assume that a guy is going to be better at sports than a female, right? Just by looking at them. So that could be your own individual kind of bias that happens as we're socialized to believe that men are more capable than women. But the more important aspect of sexism that we're going to talk about as well is the way that it operates within social institutions, the way that it gets built into the family. It gets kind of filtered into education, the way that religion structures different, kind of roles and importance for people, or other social institutions as well, like government. We look at how many elected leaders we have that are female, or any of these kind of realms, whether it's inequality in work, which we'll talk about later as well. So, sexism, it's not just about, like, if you could somehow change all of the dumb people on the internet that are like, women, blur, right? These, all these, like, incel dudes that just, like, make, I don't know, like, they spend all their time making videos about how much they hate women, and you're like, it's very surprising that women don't like you back. But, other than that kind of culture, which, again, I don't know how you diffuse something like that, getting past the individual bias that people have is one problem, but really, as sociologists, we're very interested in how is the bias put into the systems itself, like the criminal justice system, education, all sorts of different things that have different outcomes for you depending on who you are when you encounter those systems. And that's something we really like to, pull apart as sociologists. Okay, so let's look at some of those institutions. So when we look at gender and the family, traditionally parents in the U.S. prefer boys to girls, although this bias has weakened in recent decades. But especially in poor countries that are around the world, there is a pro-male bias that's very strong. Why? Why would they prefer males? Because if males have better social opportunities, like can get jobs, then they can help support their families. And they're going to be more socially successful, right? But if they have daughters, and those daughters, their only way that they can provide for the family is by marrying someone, or, not having real educational or career trajectories, then it makes sense that, oftentimes parents are going to prefer having a boy. So there's this really great documentary that really gets into this if you're interested in learning more about this. It's a devastating documentary, but so are most of the ones we talk about in sociology, right? And it's called It's a Girl. And basically that the film argues that those are some of the 3 most lethal words in the world when it comes to life, basically, that it's a girl, because so much infanticide happens, meaning in some countries that are, people have very dire situations, they may even kill their newly born female daughters so that they basically save them from a life where they have no opportunities or they're going to suffer. So it can even lead to, like, the pro-male bias goes beyond just like preferring having a son. Like, it goes to the point of literally wiping out women from the equation. So, but it's interesting that preference still translates to a culture like America, because we do have a patriarchal bent. We still do have more opportunities for men than women. So it makes sense that would kind of affect the way that parents conceptualize their own families or children. Also, the book doesn't talk about it that much, but the way that we even have roles in the family has a lot to do with gender. So we always essentialize the family as heteronormative, meaning we assume when we say family, we mean a heterosexual family with a husband and a wife and children, right? We don't really consider people a family unless they have children, which is dumb. But anyway, so if in that kind of heteronormative family model that we assume, there's a lot of patriarchy at play in the kind of American dynamic. This idea that the man is the head of the household, the king of the castle, the breadwinner, the person who, because they have more influence and power within the family, that means they have more kind of that hierarchy. We call it asymmetrical power, right? So basically, the more unequal the partnership between parents are, the kind of more likelihood there is for this inequality where one person gets to dictate the decisions for the rest of the family. And so that's kind of the traditional model of the family that a lot of people like, which is weird in America. This very patriarchal thing where, like, the guy's in charge, the woman stays home and cooks and cleans and defers to him in decision making. And, the kids are just subservient to the parents. In much more recent human history, the kind of more reality of families is that families really balance what their roles are depending on the situations that they're in, right? So, in America, the majority of families are dual income households, whether they're heterosexual or not. So if this is kind of a heteronormative assumption of a family, you're going to have 2 parents working. So the breadwinner, the person who makes more money, might be mom instead of dad. And so how does that then shift the patriarchal expectations of the king of the castle and all of these kind of things? So we'll talk later about second shift and the assumptions that women have to do more work, taking care of babies and children and taking care of elderly family members, and also taking care of the home and cooking and cleaning and all this kind of crap. While there's often still a very strong pressure on men to make their identity through their careers and financially support their families. And so a lot of that comes from the history of these gender roles and how they affect the family. But the more unequal the parents are, the more likelihood there is for violence, because a lot of times the way that patriarchal family structures were reinforced was through violence. So anyway, let's move on to education. So childhood education contains a lot of messages about gender. First of all, most of the teachers we have in the early grades are women, right? Largely because of these social understandings that women are better at taking care of little kids and therefore better suited to be in an environment around little kids all the time. And then, like, the older you get, the more male teachers you get. Oftentimes not in, like, K through 8. But when you get to high school, and especially when you get to college, the higher up you get, the more males versus females. And it's really interesting when it comes to even the hierarchies of, like, higher education itself. You'll have like, I myself am female and I'm your professor, but I have no real rank, right? Versus oftentimes when you look at the people who actually have the full-time positions, who are the chairs, who are the deans, who are the people who have the most money and power through those systems, it's not women, right? The higher you go up, the less women and the less people of color you see. So anyway, we do have this. It's really interesting too. There's a whole history behind why is it that women are the ones in early childhood education, because even the first jobs that were kind of socially considered appropriate for women in the Victorian era were like preschool teachers, because it was considered kind of like it wasn't challenging the expected role of mother and caretaker. So it doesn't go against our gender role expectations for what's appropriate as a job, right? So, it's interesting now that women are actually outpacing men in in graduation when it comes to graduating with a degree, which is a big difference. And, women have made gains in postgraduate education as well, though more men still graduate from postgraduate stuff than women at this point. So gender still really matters, especially when it comes to professional fields, right? So you have, men outnumber women in medical degrees, law degrees, dental, the things that like pay you a lot of money, the ones that like are hard to get into, more prestigious. Those are often the realms in which those extra barriers that come from being marginalized, whether it's by gender, by race, by social classes we'll talk about, really, come into play when it comes to getting to those higher levels of success. So also though, just, as a matter of fact of our experience in education, sometimes they just literally say like, okay, boys line up here, girls line up there. We learn a lot about gender in what's called the hidden curriculum of education, the kind of other rules and expectations for how we behave in the classroom. So for instance, young boys are often given much more latitude for misbehavior, for, talking at a turn, for being kind of rowdy than girls are. Because it's considered, much more deviant for a girl to be loud and rowdy and, kind of rough playing and things like that. It goes against their gender role expectations, so they're much more likely to be punished for that versus, men, if you're a young boy and you're kind of acting out more, it's considered more gender role normative. So even the way we treat kids in the classroom, the way we interpret discipline, all sorts of stuff has to do with how we interpret them based on their gender and not their individual characteristics of like who this kid is. So that's like another big impact on us. And then when it comes to gender in the mass media, only in recent decades has television really featured women as central characters. But, before that, television's incredibly male, so is film. And oftentimes, even when women are in those roles, they don't pass what's called the Bechdel Test. This very basic test, it doesn't tell you if something's feminist or not. It just tells you, like, if women exist within the role. And the idea is, the Bechdel test is very simple. So think about it the next time you're watching anything that you like. And I mean, all the stuff I love, like so many movies, so many TV shows do not meet this threshold and even have women starring in them. It's wild. So the basic threshold for the Bechdel test is, are there two female characters that both have names? Like, so it's not just like, I don't know, girl, barista girl or something like that. Like she has like a name. She's like Jane or something. Are there two female characters with names? And do they talk to each other about anything other than a man? And you'll find that like 99.9% of every blockbuster movie, of every Academy Award-winning film does not meet that basic threshold. So even when women are the leading roles in a lot of, especially movies like the rom-coms or the like what they call chick flicks kind of genre, a lot of those are really centered around like a woman getting married, a woman having a baby, something that's really more about it's still basically stories about men's lives. It's just told from the anxious perspective of a woman trying to, fit a man into social expectations or marriage or children or whatever it might be. So we do see more women in kind of central character roles, and in recent years especially much more diversity in representations when it comes to women of color, when it comes to LGBTQ plus representations of various, gender representations, it's really quite astounding just how much this has changed in recent years. But it's still incredibly unequal, and especially when it comes to children's media, is incredibly gendered, right? It's wild. I wish I had the time to show you all that kind of stuff. The way in which like children's cartoons are incredibly gendered, or how they center male narratives, or all of this weird stuff that just kind of trains us to see men as the lead role, women as the supporting role, right? You're always the Hermione and not the Harry, right? And so, this again is changing as more, women are actually making it behind the camera as well as in front of the camera, and more people of color as well. But again, it's still very much that the representations that we see the most are the ones that reflect those who already have power. And so in our culture, those are people who are white, who are affluent, and who are male. And so largely a lot of the stories that we see represent their point of view and their perspectives. And so, there's really interesting things that happen that are subtle in the media that reinforce ideas. And especially this is incredibly true when it comes to advertising. As advertising is so impactful on the way that we understand the social roles of people, and advertising plays on our insecurities. So they love to get in there about gender and make you feel like you're not man enough or not woman enough. Because why? Because then you just have to buy that big sport utility vehicle or that big ass truck. Now you're a man. Or you buy these perfect nails or these great lashes or get this hair treatment, and now you're really a woman. This idea that you're not enough. And advertising, that's its whole goal, right? It makes you feel like shit, so you buy things. And they do a great job when it comes to gender. They make billions of dollars a year for surgery companies like cosmetic surgery. You have the dieting industries, the makeup industries, like so much billions of dollars goes into just making us feel like crap. So we buy stuff to feel more like, we fit the gender, at least the gender representations that we see most promoted in the media. When it comes to representations of women, this is them as vapid, thin, very white culture, and really white features when it comes to like hair, European facial features, whatever. The beauty standard is very white, and it's very passive, right? A woman is basically just an object that you look at, that you use. She's not a person. Versus for men in recent years, men have gotten very hypersexualized. I think this has a lot to do with, I don't want to blame the Marvel franchises themselves, but if you've seen what they've done to some folks, right? You see Parks and Recreation Chris Pratt versus like a Guardians of the Galaxy Chris Pratt, and you're like, goddamn, right? And largely it's because, but it's, for me, I can't get over, I saw Chris Pratt on like Conan, I think it was, because I don't really watch a lot of those shows, but I do love me some Conan. And he basically talked about his diet that he had to do to get into like Marvel shape. And everything he described was literally an eating disorder. Like he was so obsessed about when he could eat again, what he could eat again, and it like fixed in his mind at all times. And I'm like, that's literally the definition of an eating disorder. Like they're causing these incredible celebrities to do this, but that's largely because they want them to represent a certain kind of body type that motivates men to buy more stuff, that makes men feel uncomfortable about who they are. So God forbid they just grab Chris Pratt as he was from Parks and Rec, a little pudgy, like adorable, whatever, but they have to like turn him into a chiseled version of that, right? Or of course, like a Hemsworth, that's a whole nother level. But the idea is that, they basically make these standards that like normal men can't live up to because these guys are working out like 12 hours a day. Like that's part of their job. And so how can normal men live up to that standard? They can't. In the same way that, the women that we promote as the most beautiful are often very anorexic in size or just not diverse in body type and size. And so women end up starving themselves to fit those portrayals, to better fit the scope of what the media tells them they should look like. So we'll talk more about the influence of the media. It's very important to us, especially because we live in very segregated worlds. So how media representations work really do impact us dramatically because oftentimes we don't have things to counter those narratives in our everyday lives. Okay, so looking at some other social institutions, obviously when it comes to politics, patriarchy is about power. And so because of patriarchy, women have played only a marginal role in the political history of our country. I mean, that's to be said, like in elected roles, though women have been involved in, literally fundraising and political action campaigns since there's been United States, right? We talk about the founding fathers, but we've written the founding mothers out of history completely and their impacts. But it is very interesting that politics is considered a very masculine pursuit, and it's like, who are we allowed to put in power? We have these gender stereotypes about women, that they're too emotional, that they're not stable, that they can't be good leaders. And as a result, we have this kind of thing, oh, she's going to get her period and press the button, right? And launch all the nukes. And again, that's a ridiculous characterization of people. Only in recent years have more women been elected to leadership positions within politics, especially when it comes to like the House and the Senate, these larger offices, largely because it's very hard to get funding. If you've ever heard of Emily's List, they're an organization that specifically tried to find ways to fund women to get, into these political realms. There's a great documentary called Makers, Women in Politics, that gets into the history of why is it that women have been so excluded. And it really talks about the experiences that a lot of women that were breaking those glass ceilings had once they got into the halls of power. And let's just say they weren't friendly. So it's really interesting to see just how our understandings of power are connected to masculinity and femininity. So we don't see women as leaders, though ironically we see them as mothers. And a lot of that is leadership. So anyway, when it comes to gender and religion, the fact that most of us think of God as male is no surprise, because societies give power and privilege to men. So who would create us all is a man. It's probably why all Western religions traditionally portray the divine in male terms. Throughout religious communities, though, there's a lively debate that surrounds the question of whether patriarchal traditions actually represent God's will or merely just reflect the patterns of the past and the history that's kind of gotten us to today. Things like religious beliefs are influenced by our culture, right? And so in many ways, our inequality in society has made its way into religion. So for instance, myself, I grew up Catholic. It was like there were no female, priests or bishops or, popes, any of that kind of stuff. But women could be nuns. It was like a separate but like segregated role. So a lot of the power and decision making is really put in the hands of men in that space. And so women are, kind of relegated to a lower social status. And that's not all religions. Religions vary dramatically when it comes to roles and gender and expectations. But oftentimes when it comes to the more Western religious traditions that have dominated within America, they're very patriarchal typically. And they're going to reflect traditional gender role expectations of like what's expected for us is really connected to those traditional gender roles of, male is the breadwinner, female is the homemaker or the stay-at-home mom or whatever it is. And that's just like financially not the case for most people because you just can't in today's economy. So, but religion does reiterate those value systems generationally. When it comes to gender in the military, the traditional explanation for limiting women's opportunities in the military was at first just to say they weren't as strong as men, although that argument makes a lot less sense in a situation where we're using like drones and things like that aren't as much about your muscles. But really, the reason that people oppose women in the military has to do with the organization of gender itself. And I remember when there was a lot of debate about whether or not women should fight on the front lines, a lot of the people that were saying women should not be able to were really just saying they're too distracting. They're going to be too alluring to the men and distract them and end up, hurting them in some way. And so at that time, I remember women started posting pictures of themselves fully geared up, meaning like wearing their full camo gear, their 80-pack vests with, backpacks full of stuff, their guns, their helmets, their everything, and being like, yep, super alluring, right? That, a lot of this really just has to do with our social understandings of gender and, who's allowed to be strong, who's allowed to be violent. And, that's something that we prioritize from childhood in the way that we play, right? Little girls are given dolls to play with, not guns, because we're trying to socialize them into an adult role where they'll be the parent, the mother. But little boys are given guns, they're given weapons, they're able to fight and be dirty and, really be able to kind of roll in the mud and do that kind of stuff. And so that really equates more with the understandings we have of the military and military service. So it really has a lot more to do with gender itself than any inherent, because again, for any woman to be in the military, she still has to go through the exact same basic training and qualifications and procedures as anybody else. So it's not like they're just going to oh, well, you're a woman, you come on in, you're not going to have to go through any sort of drills or basic training. But there is an assumption that there's an inherent superiority of men that makes its way into the social institution itself of the military. So kind of like with government, the higher you go up, the less women you see. And when it comes to the generals or the people that are at the very top. When it comes to gender and work, even though more women now work for pay than ever before, the range of jobs open to women is still limited. And society still labels most jobs as either feminine or masculine, and this affects what fields we go into. So think about it this way. You can tell if a job is kind of characterized as masculine or feminine by if you have to use a gender marker before it. So for instance, if I said female pilot, right? Why did I say female pilot? Because otherwise, when I say pilot, most people assume male. Or if I say, male nurse, right? Why male nurse? Because people assume when they hear the word nurse that you're talking about a female. So a lot of jobs themselves are gendered. Why? Because it's connected to the work you're doing. So, the kind of spatial reasoning needed to be a pilot, this kind of strength, leadership, power kind of expectation is going to be associated with male or masculine social traits versus being a nurse, right? Where you're providing support and caring and, compassion, but you're also, doing a difficult job. But it's often characterized as more feminine in its social role because you're doing a lot of care work. When it comes to actual hiring of people, people tend to hire people that remind them of themselves. So employers cannot discriminate between men and women when they hire or when setting pay, but it still happens. It happens all the time. Gender inequality is deeply rooted in U.S. society. So officials investigate thousands of discrimination complaints every year. So few doubt the number of cases of discrimination is just far higher than that because those are the only ones that are found out and reported. Great example of this would be Lilly Ledbetter, who they passed this thing called the Lilly Ledbetter Act as a result of her experience. She was basically this woman that worked at Goodyear Tire for over 20 years. One day she came back from lunch and there was an anonymous note on her desk telling her that she wasn't getting paid the same as her coworkers. So at the time, again, she was like the senior person in a management position, but she was the only female in that management division. And she found out as a result of her investigation after this that a few of the men that had been hired in less than 5 years in, so basically she's got 20 years, they got 5 years experience, were getting paid more than she was, even though she had 15 years more experience and more on that job. And this is really interesting because I don't know about you, but the experience I've had within the work world is that we're told not to tell each other how much money we make. And as a result, we often don't know we're getting screwed over. And so what happened was she found out they were getting paid significantly higher than her, which doesn't just affect her pay per year, but it affects, your retirement, your savings plans, all of those things over time. It's a dramatic difference. And again, someone who has 15 years less experience than you is getting paid way more than you. I'd be pissed too. So she sued them. She went through this whole thing. And basically she lost her case. And this is why it was wild. It was because they said that she had to file a complaint within 6 months of the discrimination starting. But she didn't even know the discrimination was happening. So how could she have filed a claim back then? So what happened was, obviously there was this was during the Obama years. There was an outcry against this, and Obama wrote this little executive order thing changing it. So eventually Congress did something and they passed this thing called the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which basically makes it so like if you are Lily, if you're in a situation like Lily was and you find out you're getting paid unfairly because of who you are at work, and it doesn't just have to be your gender, right? But because of a social category or identity that of who you are, that you now have 6 months from when you find out that it's happening to file a claim instead of 6 months from when it starts. Right, so that's kind of one example of, obviously Lily is not an isolated case, but she's a great example of how these things work and how a lot of times people don't know they're getting, treated unfairly. So even though we have certain numbers on the amount of discrimination that happens, whether it's in hiring whether it's in promotions or things like this, we know that it's far higher than what's actually reported. Okay, looking at stratification more in depth. So we're going to look at how stratification is found in many parts of our everyday life. So again, stratification is just the unequal distribution of power between genders in society. So when it comes to income, the gender gap in earnings means that women are more likely to be at the low end of the economic scale. So there's various reasons for the gender gap. I mean, the first and biggest reason for the gender gap is that men and women typically have different kinds of jobs. So in general, what our society considers to be men's work commands higher pay and more prestige than what our society considers to be women's work. So there's like a lot of, I literally teach a whole class about gender and I could go into a million details of this, but there's some really interesting research that shows just how pervasive this issue is, that when a career field goes from being considered male to considered female, how the prestige and the pay drop. Like, for example, the role of secretary, right? Secretary used to be a very male-dominated job position. It had a lot more prestige and pay. And then it was like, during that time period where women were entering the workforce in larger numbers, employers realized, hey, women can do everything a secretary can do. And so, but they could pay them about 30% of what they could pay a man to do it. So you started seeing a lot more women as secretaries. Nowadays, we associate the term secretary with a female. But for many years, that wasn't the case. As more women became secretaries, more men left the profession, what we call male flight. And so it actually kind of made it even more a female profession. A second reason is that everyone assigns importance to work in relation to other social roles and obligations. So the long-term effect of that is family-based gender inequality. You have a heterosexual couple, and they both go to college, they both start out at the same time with the exact same jobs. Over time, women will typically fall behind their male colleagues. There's a couple reasons for that. One, if they have kids, they're expected to often take time off of work to take care of the kids. They're the ones who are often not going to get the same promotions or positions because of that. There's this assumption that women are going to care way more about their kids and their jobs. So versus men. Men have a kid and it's like, cool, great, look at you, you're more responsible. There's actually what we call the daddy dividend. But for moms, there's this kind of impact of assumption that you're not going to care as much, that and this even happens to women who haven't had children or don't even want to have children. There's an assumption that, well, maybe this person's going to have kids and therefore not be at work as much. So if I'm going to promote people, I'm going to promote someone who is male. And so this means over time, women are making less money, having less success, less, opportunities. And, that creates a big difference when it comes to their pay overall and really what money they retire with. And then the third biggest reason for the gender gap in pay is just that, women suffer from gender discrimination, just assumptions that they're not as worthy. They don't get the benefit of the doubt in situations. And oftentimes, depending on the kind of workplace in which they're working, they could be dealing with a lot of sexism or androcentrism. So the glass ceiling is just referring to the subtle discrimination that effectively blocks the movement of women into the highest positions in organizations. There's an idea that women just don't deserve to get past that last threshold, right? That they belong in, middle management, but not upper management. Because the higher up you go, the more kind of pressure and power and expectations there are that go along with that, the less people think women are suited to do it. And this also accounts for the same way for people that have, that came from lower social classes. This is also the case for racial and ethnic minorities and immigrants, and also the case for disabled folks as well as LGBTQ plus folks. So just a little intersectionality there. Glass ceiling affects a lot of folks in that same way, but we typically think of it in a very kind of, gender duality kind of, gender binary thing of between men and women. Okay, so some more ways in which gender stratification works in our daily lives. One is housework. So just as patriarchy gives men control, of the workplace, it also assigns women most of the housework. And what's interesting about this is that it kind of, when we go to someone's home, if it's like filthy and it's a heterosexual couple, we kind of put that on the woman, right? We kind of like, whoa, what's her problem? We don't really put that on men. We kind of assume men are slovenly. And this, again, comes from especially advertising. A lot of these messages in the culture that say that men are just kind of lazy doofuses and that women like take care of them. So it's a weird kind of translation of the mothering role to mothering like the house, right? If we're all working, if everyone's in a dual income household, right, where spouses or partners are both working, then, housework is a problem because capitalism relies on the unpaid labor of women to get things done. So oftentimes wealthy people, the reason they're so successful is because they can just pay a housekeeper. They can pay a maid. They can pay a gardener to do all the outside work. They can pay a nanny to take care of their kids. Like they can pay someone to do all the work. But for the rest of us that don't have that kind of financial privilege, housework has to get done, right? It's a horrible necessary evil. As I'm like literally casting my eyes around my apartment like, ugh, I gotta do those dishes. But anyway, so, housework is something that often can become what's called a second shift for women, meaning they go to work, they work their full shift, and then they come home and they're expected to cook, to clean, to take care of family, to do a lot of those domestic household roles. Another really important issue that affects the daily experiences of people when it comes to gender stratification is violence against women. So even the term violence against women is problematic because it centers women, but it ignores men. The fact that 98% of perpetrators of violence against women are men gets lost from the analysis. It's as Jackson Katz says, when we call it violence against women, it's as if it just happens to them like the weather, and not that like they're being preyed upon by men within their social worlds, often their partners, spouses, or, just people that they know intimately in some way. So, this is a very serious problem linked to patriarchy. And part of this is that the physical violence against women is justified by inequality between the partners, right? So the more power that a man has over a woman, the more likely he can leverage that into violence. So assault, rape, and even murder are common enough that many sociologists view them as a dimension of men's domination of women, right? So for instance, when we look at mass shooters, stuff like that, there's a strong component of domestic violence there. A lot of these people have domestic violence rap sheets ahead of time, or the first person they kill before they go on their spree is a parent or a partner, or maybe a lot of times it's a status loss, a loss of power. So men will go on these killing sprees, but typically it starts with their spouse. So it'll be something like they break up from their partner, they lose their job, these like kind of large status changes in someone's life, often because we tell men that they can't seek help, they can't go to therapy, or they're weak. So what do? What does our culture say you do when you're down and you're a man and you need to get your power back? You pick up a gun. That's what the culture says. That's what every action movie says, right? I think about the movie Taken. It's such a great example. Everyone's seen that crap. Liam Neeson isn't like, I'm going to call the embassy and I'm going to make sure they fight for an exchange of my daughter so that she'll be safe. He's like, I'm going to come kill you and everyone that's even loosely associated with you without talking to them, without any hint of negotiation of any kind. He just straight up murders dozens of folks to get his daughter back, right? And we're like, yay, America, that's good. That's the way you should handle that. And you're like, is it? Is that the way we should handle situations like that? No, you should call the consulate, right? You should be dealing with like the State Department. Anyway, so we really teach this, and this isn't just like one narrative. It's like almost every film narrative, right? You lose power, you pick up a gun, you get your power back. So it's not surprising that so many people actually do this in life, right? And, whether it's from beating their own spouses or, escalating to larger, mass shootings and other kind of killing sprees that we see, very incredibly common within American society, which is just not the case when you look at other cultures. They don't have the same problem with guns. They don't have the same problem with spree killers or, mass shootings that we do. And again, even when it comes to just assault and rape, the number of people that are assaulted and raped are incredibly high, much higher than other cultures. And we already know that it's an incredibly underreported crime because of the way that we assume, we'll talk about this later, this idea of rape culture. We live in a culture that justifies rape. And it's just horrifying to think like one of the most horrible things you could do to somebody is justified in our culture. Of course it is, right? Because what do we do if someone is raped? We immediately look at them and say, well, what did you do? What were you wearing? Were you drinking? Well, did you send the wrong message? Did you go home with this guy? We never just turn to the rapist and go, how dare you? What gave you the right? When someone says no, or when someone struggles, or when someone, to drug someone, or to, get them too drunk to be able to consent, or whatever it might be, why don't we never turn to the rapist and say, you did something wrong? We turn to the woman and say, why didn't you protect yourself from this man better? Right? And we know men are also the victims of a lot of rape, but we know that, again, over 97% of rapists themselves are men. So this is more of a male issue than a woman's issue. But when we call these things violence against women, it gets relegated as a women's issue and therefore not taken as seriously in the culture. Sexual harassment is another huge one when it comes to people's lived experiences. It refers to unwanted comments, gestures, or physical contact of a sexual nature. And so if society doesn't define sexual harassment as a problem, then men in positions of power are free to coerce sex from women they supervise. And this used to be the case, right? That sexual harassment as a term didn't come about until after the second wave of the women's rights movement, in the late 60s, early 70s. This is when we got the term sexual harassment. Before this was just the experience. So nowadays we all go through sexual harassment trainings and things of this nature, but the actual claims or that people file of sexual harassment is just as high now as it was 30 years ago. So clearly it's still a horrible, pervasive problem in our culture. The majority of women report experiencing sexual harassment at some workplace, throughout their lifetime, and that's horrible, right? So we need to have a situation where people can work with dignity no matter who they are without being harassed because of their, social identities. And this is something that, if you want to learn more about the history of this stuff, I really recommend the documentary Anita that covers the Anita Hill trial when Clarence Thomas was put on the Supreme Court. And instead of taking it seriously, the Senate Judiciary Committee, led by Joe Biden, I might add, grilled her and turned her into the focus of the spotlight, like saying, well, maybe she's just a scorned woman. Maybe she got rejected by him and that's why she's coming out against him. Or, maybe she just wants her 10 minutes of fame. Or the best one, that she just wanted to malign a black man to drag him down. And you're like, why? Why would she want that? She was coming out because she didn't want someone that had that kind of history to be able to have that kind of lifetime appointment and that much power, which has been problematic. And now he's got his buddy there with him that had an almost exactly same situation, the Brett Kavanaugh situation, except for instead of it being claims of sexual harassment within a workplace, here's the best part. Clarence Thomas was working at the EEOC when the Anita Hill complaints happened. The EEOC oversees cases of sexual harassment. So, the dude who's in charge of, sexual harassment nationally was sexually harassing his employees. Other people came out afterwards, other than just Anita. But, it was a very galvanizing moment in women's rights history. It actually kind of started the third wave of the feminist movement because people were just so pissed that it was so obvious this guy had done something wrong and he still got on the Supreme Court for life. Anyway, and now his buddy Brett is there to split a six-pack with him. Okay, so then when looking more at sexuality, beauty, and reproduction, so patriarchal culture teaches men to assess women not according to their abilities, not according to their minds, but according to their sexual attractiveness. And if a woman isn't considered sexually attractive, then she's not considered important in the culture. So we tend to see this especially reflected in the media, that women that once they hit past childbearing age, right, or even just like to the late childbearing years, they just disappear from television and become less, or from films and become less relevant. So all these A-list celebrities that we all fawn after, they then just disappear once they hit their 40s, or, especially 50s. Nowadays, you have a couple token folks that are older than this that are still working in the field. But think about it. How impossibly young do they look, right? Like the Jennifer Anistons or the Jennifer Lopez's that like in their 50s look good, right? That's not a normal that most people can live up to. And, as a result of having a lot of financial privilege, they can leverage that into looking beautiful for longer, looking youthful for longer, which is what keeps them in the popular culture, right? But if women don't age perfectly, they just disappear. But grizzled old dudes can still find roles, right? You still have like old ass dudes, like, Harrison Ford's still getting a lot of roles. He was the handsome, action hero in the 70s, but he's still able to get roles today. And oftentimes when it comes to these older actors, they get these roles and their female counterpart that they'll have some romantic interest with is like 30 years younger. It's like literally like their child. And it's very upsetting. But what it does tell you is that men can continue to be interesting, can continue to be the important part of the story, and that women are really only important as to when you can put babies in them. And then once that's over, they're not important, because we're basically saying what's important is how they look, not, who they are. And that really translates to how we then treat people. Okay, so looking into how different theories interpret gender inequality. So structural functional analysis looks at gender and complementarity. That's like not a word you say a lot, right? So basically, and again, Talcott Parsons is old. That dude was saying stuff you can tell by the black and white photo. This guy is not a spring daisy. This was like a while ago. So just keep that in mind. So structural functional analysis basically was saying that if we have different gender roles, like if men are supposed to do one thing and if women are supposed to do another thing, that then we have clearly defined roles where we only do our part, and this can create a mutual interdependence. So meaning like if you have a man going and working full time and he's the breadwinner, and then you have a woman who doesn't work at all and just stays home and cleans and raises babies, that their different roles link the family together and they depend on each other, this mutual interdependence. Still, it's this whole thing of, the expected roles can really weigh on relationships when there's conflict that arises often about trying to navigate who does what. And so someone like Talcott Parsons would say, well, if you have a defined role, then there's no conflict, because you're like, well, you do this, I do that, the end. But nowadays, there's much more kind of diversity and expressions here. And, there's a lot of criticism of Talcott Parsons' role there because, again, it's a very limiting structure. And it really only reflected like the wealthiest white families, because those were the only families that actually had the financial opportunity to have, one income really support the family and live in a good standard of living, right? Okay, moving on to symbolic interaction analysis. So they are always looking at how do we make meanings and how we interact. So, they basically would look at how, when we look at gender in everyday life, that we interact and make those gender distinctions possible. So when it comes to gender and behavior, the more power people have, the more choices they have about how to behave. So in general, our society gives men greater freedom in personal behavior than it does for women. Unless, I should put a caveat there, unless they want to do anything that's considered feminine. And then they are highly policed or highly criticized or demonized for doing so. I mean, gender also comes into the use of space, right? Because men have greater social power, they typically use more physical space than women. So whether men are speaking in front of a group at work or relaxing on the sidelines at a sporting event, they tend to, we call it man-spreading, right? This idea of just kind of like spreading out. So, okay, looking at language. Language is so important in how we understand the world and how we interact with each other. So, language is something that is very interesting to symbolic interactionists. So, the English language tends to give what's masculine more value than what is feminine. So, traditional titles that are associated with men, like king or lord, have positive meanings, but comparable titles for women are often more negative. I mean, not in our current nomenclature, you'd say, oh, you're a queen. I mean, that's a whole nother interpretation, right? But that kind of comes much more from communities of color and from LGBTQ plus communities. So, kind of fighting back against the larger norms of society. So anyway, the English language, though, itself, like even if you look at the majority of the books that are considered the canon of Western literature, they're often written from a male perspective with a male voice. You kind of get this assumption that male is the default category and that women are different than that. So I was one of that first generation of folks that, because of the second wave feminists, they started changing the way that we talk about gender in the late 80s, early 90s. And so I was, a product of that myself, where they changed words like, I think I mentioned this before, one of the other lectures, about how instead of saying firefighter, instead of saying fireman, you'd say firefighter. Or instead of, policeman, you say police officer. Or instead of mailman, you say postal worker, postal carrier. Because then those things become gender neutral, and there's an opportunity for women to be in that role, right? If you say policeman, a woman inherently doesn't fit that role, right? But if you say police officer, you still probably think of a man if you close your eyes and thought police officer. But since it's gender neutral enough, there's an opportunity for a woman to actually be part of that. So that's kind of one way in which language has changed a little bit. Or you see the kind of like ESS that's put on everything that's women to make it inferior or less than. So like you could be a host or hostess, right? Things like that, where they put the ESS on it to tell you that it's less than. And this is why a lot of people within Hollywood have stopped using the term actress and just say actor, because actor is actually the definition of what they do. Actress, R-E-S-S, is just to kind of say that, oh, well, you're a female version of that. It's therefore less than, therefore not an actor. And so it's just these subtle ways that language reinforces for us the hierarchy of society, that women are considered inferior, that women are not as important as men. And this is just so baked into the words we use in our everyday life, right? And so some criticisms of symbolic interaction is that because it focuses so much on our interplay of how we talk to each other and how we interact, it often misses the larger structural forces that are really, affecting how we then interact in those spaces. Okay. So then looking at social conflict analysis or conflict theory, and they're always obviously going to look at gender from the lens of inequality. So they argue that rather than promoting social integration like the functionalists say, those traditional gender roles, conflict theory argues that gender really generates conflict between men and women because they characterize it as men having power and women not having power. In any situation where one group has and one group doesn't have, it inherently causes conflict. So Engels, who was Marx's co-writer for a lot of Marx's stuff, wrote about the rise of patriarchy and talked about how men enjoy more wealth and power than women. In addition, to ensure an ever-expanding market for capitalist production, society teaches women that personal happiness lies in marriage and domestic life as a consumer of products and services. So every narrative for women from childhood is about when are you going to get married? When are you going to have babies? And it really characterizes that as the most important role for women, not who they are as a career person, but who they are as just, reproducing the family, being a parent, right? When they ask little kids, do you want to be president? When girls are little, just as many of them want to be as boys, but as they get older and they hit adolescence, especially 11, 12, 13, in that age, it's all about getting a boyfriend and boys and all of this stuff, so that women often change who they are or learn to to silence themselves, make themselves smaller, make themselves different, literally physically change their bodies so that they can gain the approval of men, right? And so this characterizes those relationships and really that kind of identity development very differently for men and women in society. And then, a criticism, though, of this would just be that, while there is inequality that happens, you kind of need more of an intersectional analysis to really look at how inequality is not just about gender, it's about a lot of other intersecting identities. So let's jump into that. So intersection theory is really going to talk about the case of minority women. So intersectional theory, again, is an analysis of how race, class, gender, sexuality, disability, age, all sorts of other factors often create multiple disadvantages for some categories of people. So when we talked about this idea that, women make less money than men, right? We always talk about that as the wage gap. But the wage gap also has a racial component, right? So it's interesting when you talk about the wage gap between men and women in society. If you say that women on average make about 77 or 75, depending on the research, cents to the male dollar, they mean the white male dollar. They don't mean all men, because not all men have power and privilege, right? The intersecting identities that they have are going to affect how much power and privilege they have. So if a man is from a lower social class, he doesn't have as much power. If he has a disability, if he's a sexual minority, right? All of these other, if he's a racial or ethnic minority, these other factors affect the social worth and definition in the culture, which then, of course, impacts how much money you get made, like, or how much money people pay you, right? How much value you are considered to have. So when we look at the kind of pay dynamics, it's typically Asian women make about 78 cents to that dollar, white women about 77 cents. And these are figures from like the mid 2015 era, so it might be a little bit different now. And you have a situation where African American women were only making about 64 cents compared to 77 cents for white women, and many Latinas making only about 56 or 55 cents to that same $1. So it's not just about being a woman, it's about, well, what's your status and other intersecting identities, right? If you have a disability, that's going to affect the kind of roles and opportunities and the ways that people see your social value, right? If you're a racial ethnic minority, all of those stereotypes and history and kind of cultural prejudice and discrimination is going to factor into your opportunities as well. So by looking at these things in an intersectional way, we see that gender is an important factor, but it's not the only factor in how we understand each other. So really, we have to look more clearly and more, intersectionally to see the full picture of what's going on. Okay, so looking at feminism, feminism is just a political movement that seeks social equality. And again, it used to be very much like social equality for women, right? But that's very second wave ideology. Once we get to the third wave past, it's much more about a multicultural analysis. This is also where we get the spin-off of masculinity research and queer theory. So there's a lot kind of under this feminist umbrella that also incorporates, the perspectives and experiences of diverse people with diverse gender expressions. So when looking at feminist foundations, they're really interested in the importance of gender in society, how it organizes and structures our lived experiences and our opportunities. Feminists are also looking at the importance of equality and, having situations where we value people equally gives them more social space and more social opportunity. It actually enhances the culture in many ways, like especially just like an economic analysis. When you give women more opportunities, more education, they don't just have more social value, they have more economic value, and the economic value of a country increases dramatically. Feminists also look at the importance of choice, right? The ability to control your own body, to have bodily autonomy, to not have the government force you to give birth when you don't want to. This is huge. This one's a huge one, because how could women make inroads into education and into career fields if they can't control when and if they have children? So we know that this is, same thing with sexual freedom. This is another importance of sexual freedom, of not being controlled by, or, having their sexual autonomy controlled or manipulated by anyone else. That, women should be able to have sex for fun and not just to make babies. And that's like a big feminist impact of the second wave of the women's rights movement that came about during the time period of kind of what we call the sexual revolution. What's really interesting to me is that in the late 60s, the sexual revolution was very tied to feminist thinking, to more equitable thinking about women. Nowadays, our current version of this, what we call hookup culture, is it profoundly anti-feminist and profoundly wrapped up in rape culture. So it's really interesting how sexual freedom used to be associated with respecting women as more than just childbearers, but it really evolved to just being like, how many women can you sleep with so you can, like, your bro friends pat you on the back or whatever. It's just such an interesting evolution in the culture that at some point, the feminist ideals that went along with sexual freedom uncoupled from it. And now we have this weird hookup culture that's all about, like, kind of prioritizing what's considered male pleasure and male orgasms and not women's experiences or pleasure. So, feminists also look at creating activism to change situations of inequality, right? So they often have activism against patriarchy and against gender violence, trying to call out the unequal distribution of power in society, and also trying to counter the fact that there's a lot of violence that results from this unequal distribution of power. And that's really the key to creating a more equitable world, is establishing more equitable beliefs and making sure that makes its way into the social institutions instead of prejudice and sexism, which has made its way into social institutions. So there's different types of feminists, right? We tend to think of feminists as like some one thing. I don't know. The media has been really good at this. And this isn't by accident, right? It's not like by accident that we think of feminists in a negative way. It's like a multi-billion-dollar media campaign that's been going on since the 1980s, when basically women were identified as the biggest threat to the change in social order, especially with the Equal Rights Amendment and a lot of other legislation that was going on at that time period, post second wave of the women's rights movement. Within like a decade, women got equity within education, within career fields, within all sorts of stuff, sexual harassment protections for families, and protections for pregnancy, all sorts of stuff that like did not jive well for a lot of people that don't believe in women's equality. So in the 80s, we got this huge backlash against women's rights, and that's when like feminism became like the F word. Like they're like these crotchety man burning bras or whatever. It's just like a weird stereotype, but it makes sense, right? It makes sense that people in power would have to characterize these people and stereotype them in a negative way so that they could keep their power. So anyway, it's worked. It's worked really well. So a lot of women don't even themselves identify as feminists, even though, literally socially benefit them to do so. But spoiler, if you think that, men and women should have equal opportunities within education and work, then you're a feminist. If you think that, mothers shouldn't be solely responsible for raising children, then you're a feminist. Like, it's really not that hard. If you think that people deserve rights regardless of what biological sex they were born into, then you're a feminist. It's really that easy. But the culture has maligned it into this kind of really angry, hateful thing. But there's a bunch of different kinds of feminists, and this is what makes it complicated to determine like what course forward that feminists want to take, because there's different kinds of feminists that are informed by their own backgrounds as to what they think should be done to address patriarchy and inequality. So liberal feminists, remember, we're going to talk a lot about liberals. Liberal means you think like you believe in changing the system within the system. So liberals want to like pass laws, if that makes sense. So liberal feminism seeks a society in which all people are treated as individuals, so that, women or men or whatever gender you might be can freely develop their talents and pursue their interests regardless of gender. And to do that, liberals will argue that we need laws like the Equal Rights Amendment, something that can, you can sue against if if those protections aren't honored, right? Socialist feminists are really looking at it through the lens of this kind of Marxist class revolution understanding. So they're going to say that, it's not just about securing equality for women, but for all people. And they look at the inherent influence of capitalism in structuring and hierarching inequalities between men and women, but also between, again, racial and ethnic minorities, between social classes, between all sorts of other groups in society are maligned because we privilege the wealthiest, white men who are not disabled as the ideal. And so basically socialist feminists are really looking at the kind of power dynamics involved, who has power, who doesn't, and saying that, everyone, regardless of who they are, and not just on the category of gender, should have, equal opportunities. Radical feminists are arguing that patriarchy itself is built into the concept of gender itself. So you can't just modify gender, you have to get rid of gender. So nothing short of ending the distinction between people's bodies at all is actually going to bring around equality, because so much of our meanings are tied to this idea of being masculine or feminine or male or female. And we're kind of seeing this play out of what they're arguing when we have more kind of understandings of people who are transgender, who are gender nonconforming, who are non-binary, who are gender fluid, kind of showing how when they just disrupt or destroy the sense of gender, it creates a lot more equity and really opportunities for their own expression and freedom. But we also know in the society wants to repress people and push them back into a box that's in a binary that we can kind of point to and say you're this or you're that. So as a result, people can face violence by, pushing back or transgressing gender expectations, as radical feminists would ask them to do. And then multicultural and global feminism is just informed by insights that were gained from intersectional, analysis or intersectional theory. So women share common experiences of oppression in relation to men, but women also have various racial and ethnic identities. They have different social class positions. They have all sorts of different intersections that inform their specific experience, right? So whether you are documented or undocumented is going to affect your experience, right? Whether you're disabled or not, whether you're poor or whether you're rich, all of these things also have an impact on the ways in which we understand the world. And global feminism as well, connecting the lived experiences of women within Western culture that tends to be privileged when we talk about feminism in the world. Second wave of feminism, for all the good they did, what they did also do was privilege and put perspectives on women that were middle class or wealthier and women who were white. And so that's kind of where we get this term white feminism. It's more about the second wave time period where, and again, not all women or feminists from that period were white feminists, or they themselves white, right? But there was kind of a preferencing of the experiences of middle class to white women in the rights movements that were motivated at that time, right? In the third wave, and really arguably we're in a fourth wave now, there's much more inclusion of people of varying perspectives and really trying to center the experiences of folks that are the most marginal. And especially when this comes to people in the developing world instead of people in developed, industrialized Western societies, women who are working 16-hour days in sweatshop labor, are connected to American women today because American women today are using all the products and wearing all the clothes that those women are, getting exploited to make. So there is a connection between, people all over the globe when it comes to exploitation, especially in the realm of globalization and capitalism. I mean, we're very connected, even though we feel very disconnected. But, the focus of multicultural and global feminism is really looking at, how do we understand a more intersectional understanding of what rights we need to address and what inequalities need to be dealt with. Okay, so then looking at this from different political perspectives, we're going to look at how different positions on the political spectrum interpret these kind of movements, or whether, it's feminism as a movement or as a discipline. So conservatives basically focus on what they call the value of families. So a lot of conservatives really see a historical trend towards gender equality as causing a problem to the extent that it weakens the traditional family structure of breadwinner and housewife, right? So although most conservatives support women working in the workplace, they're also, going to, and a lot of polling shows like they'll also vote for women running for positions of national leadership. But most conservatives also want to see a government policy that strengthens families and prioritizes traditional families and traditional family values. Again, I don't know why I keep using Pelosi as an example. She just keeps popping up in my head. It's from that documentary I recommended earlier, Makers, Women in Politics. She talked about how the first time she ran for office, which was like a billion years ago, they asked her who was going to take care of her kids, and her youngest kid was like 18 at the time, and she kind of was like, what do you mean, who's going to take care of my kids? And she realized that's a question no one's ever asked a man when they're running for office. Well, if you're running for office, who's taking care of your kids, right? So, even as, she's had a long career in politics, just that impact has changed a lot. As for new people going into the House and Congress today are, hopefully not experiencing those same kind of stigmatized, relationships as previously. But a lot of conservatives would say that all of the social problems we see, whether it's, especially pointing at more marginalized communities like poor communities or communities of color, that often gets blamed on the quote-unquote breakdown of the family. This idea that if fathers were present, if, mothers were staying at home or whatever it might be, then a lot of the social ills that happen within poor neighborhoods wouldn't happen, right? But largely that analysis that they have is ignoring history. It's ignoring globalization and the impact that has had. And we'll talk more about work and all of those things later. But how many historical policies created the inequality we see today and maintain the inequality we see today? So it's not just a matter of individual responsibility. We have to look at these things structurally as well. Okay, so then liberals would basically look at the pursuit of equality. So liberals, again, want to change the system itself. They don't want to get rid of the system. Like if you look at it, conservatives want to go back often to a prior time in the system. Liberals want to change the system from within for the future, and radicals usually want to destroy the system and rebuild a new system that doesn't have all that crap that was built in over time in it, right? And try and create new systems that don't perpetuate inequality. So that's like my sum up of that. But basically, more in depth, liberals, they view changes in families over recent decades not as like the decline of the family, but reflecting the reality that most families now need two working adults to make ends meet because of the changes in the overall economy. So some liberals support a policy of comparable worth by which women and men would receive the same pay, not just for doing the same work, but also for working or doing different work that has the same value. So this is kind of that promotion of, instead of, ending that pay gap, if we say, oh, it's equal pay for equal work, what if we're working in different industries? It's hard to make that equitable. So basically, a lot of liberals are arguing that what we should be doing is giving people equal pay based on qualifications, relative qualifications. So if you need, X amount of years of schooling to do something, X amount of years of experience, that should be the threshold of how much pay you get, and not if you're going into a career field like nursing that's overwhelmingly female, or a career field like piloting that's overwhelmingly male, that it shouldn't be a reflection of the people in the position as much as it should be a reflection of the individual's worth and how much time and effort they've put into their own education and qualifications. All right, so again, the radical left, they believe we just got to change the system completely. So most left radicals target the current economic and political systems as the issue of why there's so much inequality in society. I mean, obviously, if you're getting paid inequitably, that has all sorts of ramifications across society. Also, if you just can't get as many jobs or promotions, there's things of that nature too that also have a lot of ramifications. And so this kind of like under the radical left, that kind of influence of socialist feminists would say that if you want to solve gender inequality, you just have to transform the capitalist economy into a much more socialist system, one that, has a lot more support for workers and also provides a lot of, compensated things. Like, think about it this way. In a lot of other cultures, especially, other Western societies like our own, Western developed societies, people have paid family leave. So when they have a baby, they don't have to worry about how are they going to pay their bills. They have universal health care, so they don't get charged $10,000 every time they have a child, or, thousands of dollars every time their child gets an injury. They also have free college and often free childcare or subsidized childcare programs. So that, like in France, for instance, one of the examples in the film Sicko goes into this. People pay about, in relative terms, and this of course was in 2007, but it's still pretty low in relative terms. They paid about $2 an hour for their children to be in daycare, and not like any daycare, but like licensed, qualified people that teach the kids things instead of it just being like warehousing children. Here in California, you're likely to, for a licensed daycare facility, pay almost as much as you would for tuition at the Cal States for your kid to be in a daycare that isn't teaching them Mandarin Chinese or how to play piano or something like that. Because I would expect, if I'm paying that much money, I want a return on that investment, right? But that's just not the case in the United States. This all gets put on the family and the individuals within the families, often women, to figure out how to kind of bridge those gaps. And oftentimes it just results in some families really, really struggling, and that means children going without food or shelter or having the essentials they need to thrive in their lives just because of the social positions of their parents. So, radical left would say, let's make a more of a transformation towards more socialized systems that, we already have things that are socialized, like the police or the firefighters. Like when your house lights on fire, you don't have to call a service that you then pay thousands of dollars to come put out the fire. There's a social utility to fires not raging, right? So there's things like that are very common that we already have in our society, but they could be expanded like they are in other Western societies that would dramatically affect the daily lived experiences of folks, whether it's, putting food on the table, keeping a roof over their heads, keeping the lights on, or just giving them an opportunity to spend more quality time with their families instead of having to work so much, so hard, and make those sacrifices where, they're working 16-hour days and they don't get to spend the quality time with their children in the way that wealthy families do because they have more financial privilege. So anyway, that transformation would end the trend towards economic inequality and even eradicate class distinctions, give everyone opportunities in the land of quote-unquote opportunity. Okay, so then going on from here, the gender gap in pay has remained much the same for decades, partly because many people continue to assume that men and women should do different kinds of work. Another part of that too, though, this is what kills me, is the actual reduction in the gender gap has largely been the result not of women getting paid more, but of men getting paid less. And that is not the kind of equality anyone's looking for, is the equality of struggling. So in addition, many people think that family responsibilities fall more to women than men. And so that cultural value system means that women just have to spend way more time doing that stuff, which means you have less time to work, less time to, pursue that stuff. Also, given that such beliefs remain with us that, women should be taking care of families, it seems likely that for the foreseeable future, that women will, or many women will still be expected to, not do the same kind of work as men, that to earn less money than men, or to not share chores domestically equally with men. Though younger generations are much more egalitarian when it comes to their roles, though alternatively the same, having a very strict domestic expectations for women means that's less time they can work, that's less time they can put to their own creativity and time and life, because they're so wrapped up in doing all the things for everyone else, right? So kind of going on from here, we have to really look at how things are changing. Younger generations are learning better roles and better ways to navigate these problems. And as that happens, hopefully that inequality will also reduce, and we'll see more positive kind of results of that filtering through the culture.